That's a very mild reaction compared to the right wing's reaction to the Green New Deal, which was to express astonishment at the stupidity of it, that this is just a economically illiterate patchwork of lunacy about unicorn farts and, giving everybody a pony, and my God, what would possess all these progressive Democrats to even suggest this insanity? And, trying to get good, honest taxpayers to pay for some sort of basic income for those who are unwilling to work. Those who are unwilling to work should just starve. And I want to think about that for a second, because I think that it's very odd that this comes from the most stalwart defenders of the capitalist economic system.
Although we often associate the concept of language as social control with the author George Orwell, the use of weaponized verbiage may be better attributed to Chairman Mao during his Cultural Revolution. Here, the introduction of certain magical words, whose use or misuse mark someone as right-thinking or counter-revolutionary, were employed to bend society to the desired end via normal functioning social interactions. The efficacy of the strategy is obvious. It's one thing to fight the secret police, quite another to fight the disapprobation of your friends and neighbors over the words you use every day. As such, conformity may be obtained with only a very limited exertion of the state apparatus. While far from the totalitarian nature of Maoist China, many in the contemporary West have noticed a similar phenomenon forming in our own era's progressive cultural revolutionaries. The injection of specific words and cliches into the discourse to reframe the conversation and hinder dissent has been a recognized element of political correctness for well on 3 decades now. But far from a minor irritation, these words persist in our language, and despite their users' ability to understand their origin or even their meaning, they are invariably controlling the direction of our culture. People often comment how difficult it is to get progressives into a conversation. Very few people who claim to understand progressive ideas ever want to talk about them with critics. However, we are in constant dialogue with progressive ideas every time we encounter these types of words in the media we consume or in the casual conversations we have with friends, family, and acquaintances who have absorbed the terminology through cultural osmosis. I have spoken much about the culture war in discourse, and what I think is needed next is an answer and a methodology for fighting these concepts in casual conversations. Conversations that might be entirely unpolitical and with people who have entirely unpolitical motives. We need an understanding of how these terms work inside our own discourse and how we can subvert their influence. A defense against the dark arts of language manipulation, and a guide to magical words and how to fight them. I'm dipping back into my Magical Word series after a long hiatus. As people might remember, I started the Magical Word series as an attempt to confront what I saw as weaponized verbiage by the left, certain words that were used to terminate thought and reposition the dialogue, without, after everything is said, really meaning anything. A magical word is a word that really doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean. It's an emotional signifier, an ideological trigger point designed to set off a reaction, an emotional response. As always, you know you've found a magical word, or have a good reason to believe you found a magical word, when you have a sentence that is an emotionally powerful sentence, but when the critical magical word is replaced by a synonym, or its supposed synonym, the sentence somehow loses its emotional resonance. The power is taken away. As in most elements of language that communicate nothing and offer no clarity on thought, magical words degrade the dialogue. They transform honest communications into a type of implicit kabuki theater, where everyone is signifying a political position that's not really being talked about openly. In the first part of this series, I took on the big magical words of our era: racism, gender, whiteness. But at this stage, I feel it's finally time to come back to a magical word that I think has dominated our political conversation for almost 200 years. a magic word that's degraded our society's very ability to talk about economics and inequality in an honest way, and a magical word that I think we can see having very real consequences for America's own dialogue about politics and economics. And this magical word is none other than capitalism, the description of our own status quo political order. Emotionally, everyone has an idea of what capitalism is. It conjures up images of tycoons in top hats holding money bags, images of Adam Smith, of mercantile traders and oligarchs, of big bank executives and of money changers. And sure enough, all of these things are very real. Money is the force that makes the world go round, especially in our modern economic system. And it is indeed true that economic woes are at the center of many of our troubles. We have a financial crisis caused by dishonest use of leverage and loans. We have an inequality problem caused by global trade and runaway corporatism. It seems, after all of this, that capitalism, at least in the vague emotional sense, is a very useful term. It's quite topical to the problems we're dealing with, isn't it? So, with all of this, what's the problem? How could capitalism be a magical word? It sounds real enough to me. Well, as always, the devil is in the details. Certainly, capitalism is a very vague word. That itself doesn't make it magical. And it exists as a phenomenon. We could talk about capitalism emerging at some time as a way of human organization, as a method of structuring human hierarchies. Of course, dictionary definitions of capitalism abound, but for this purpose, we could say that capitalism is simply industrial corporatism, the development of the joint stock corporation paired with the Industrial Revolution and mass production. With this definition, capitalism definitely did develop as a historical phenomenon, starting in Europe, first in northern Italy, and then coming to culmination in the lowlands during the 15th to 17th centuries. Under this definition, we definitely live in capitalism's wake, and it does define many of the problems we deal with in our own modern economic system, as different as it is from 15th and 16th century Holland. Still, perhaps another more basic and more fundamental definition of capitalism would be just to conflate it with large-scale trade, or the market in general. Under this more fundamental definition, capitalism is much broader, but it still is a historical phenomenon. Humans did make a transition between trading largely among families, among people they knew, towards a social organization that encouraged farmers and craftsmen to put their wares on a general market, to trade with people they didn't know or would never physically see. This was quite a distinct turning point in human culture, albeit harder to pin down since it was much more gradual. If we were forced to put a date on this, we might attach the development of capitalism to the 13th century market revolution, at least in Europe. But in either case, both of these definitions give us a concept of what capitalism might be. And in both cases, capitalism might be a problem. It might on balance be worse for humanity. It might need some kind of reform, even a radical one. But I noticed that this type of highly specific and meaningful definition of capitalism is really rarely what activists and even intellectuals on the left seem to be talking about when they talk about the problem of capitalism. What both the market revolution and the industrial revolution represent is a technology, perhaps one that has problematic consequences, but nonetheless a development in humanity that needs to be dealt with in nuance. But oftentimes in intellectual circles on the left, we hear about a need to tear down capitalism, to abolish it. Activists on the street say things like, we need to smash capitalism. And of course, professors talk about late capitalism, something that makes little sense if we're talking about a technological or organizational development. Certainly I wouldn't be the first to point out that for many people on the radical left, if not for most people on the radical left, capitalism has become a catch-all term for everything that is wrong with the world, be it culture, government, economics, the limitations of democracy. Very few problems in the world, under this leftist view, don't have their origins traced directly back to capitalism in one way, shape, or form. And this is not the passive attribution that, say, a reactionary will use towards the concept of modernity. This isn't a subtle mode that humanity has slid into unconsciously. When leftists talk about capitalism, they mean it as something very active and very real. Something that is almost akin to an institution, something that can be torn down, and something that is everywhere insidiously standing in front of the progress people know needs to happen. It doesn't seem that we could replace capitalism with the corporate form or the market revolution and have any leftist slogans really maintain their emotional power or really their meaning. And so it appears at once that the word capitalism may have magical properties. Now, in typical form for these videos, I usually provide a definition of the word I'm looking at and examine its etymological origins, how an innocuous word evolved over many generations to be implicitly political, to communicate an ideological perspective, even though many people might use the word quite innocently. But for the word capitalism, I don't think such a background is needed. For one, capitalism itself, the word, almost exclusively comes up in the context of politics. People are aware the word has an ideological meaning. People oftentimes learn what the ideological meaning of capitalism is before they even get the dictionary definition of the word. Moreover, if we're looking back into history, trying to figure out who provided capitalism with its magical properties, who turned this word into an ideological tool, there is no mystery because the transformation really came from one person. And that person is, of course, Karl Marx. There probably is no way to do this video about the word capitalism without also implicitly doing a video about Marxism and the work of Karl Marx. Our current understanding, our current use of the word capitalism, in its emotional sense, in its ideological sense, comes 100% from Marx's works, and there's really no way around it. And to understand how capitalism is poisoning our dialogue, we really have to understand, I think, the critical mistakes in Marxism itself. Now, of course, being on the right and probably talking to an audience that is mostly on the right, I think it will come as no surprise to anyone listening that I am an anti-Marxist. And being a fervent anti-Marxist, I think people oftentimes expect me to say that Marx had no good ideas, that Marx really had no legitimate points. But I don't think that this is entirely the case. Marx did have some good ideas. He did make some legitimate criticisms of the economic system of his own time, and through that implicitly he made some legitimate criticisms of the economic system of our own time. But while I look at this figure and the oversized role he plays in our own contemporary dialogue over economics and politics, I think there is good reason to be an anti-Marxist, Marx's own fair criticisms about economics aside. And that is while I believe that Marx did have some good ideas and some even original ideas, I don't believe Marx ever had a good original idea. It is true that Marx had a certain exciting way of writing. He did have some very choice quotes, and he had a way of making snappy observations about the status quo that seemed more profound than they actually were. But when it comes to honest examination of economics and political reality, I believe Marx has ultimately degraded the dialogue. He's held our conversation about human development back, and to this day I still think Marx is most interesting for the mistakes he made, and the mistakes that his acolytes in the modern world continue to make again and again and again and again. Now, for those on the left watching this video, they may think I'm crazy. After all, Marx does have a larger-than-life image. There is a legend of Karl Marx. Agree or disagree, he does seem to be a colossal figure. But I would argue that this prominence is largely a political construction, a fiction developed mostly by his followers, in order to make the highly seductive political philosophy that Marx proposed seem more intellectually important and rigorous than it actually was. The myth goes something like this. For all ages, humanity had been oppressed under a ruling class, a group of property holders, of kings, of priests, that dominated the destiny of the working class, until in the Industrial Revolution, this oppression and inequality reached a crescendo, with private business owners being able to exploit workers and destroy communities, all in the name of profit and money. Then, like a brilliant flash of light, Karl Marx enters the scene, calling out the deficiencies of finance-driven post-industrial society, pointing out the fundamental flaws of the free market, and calling for a revolution to install equality-driven worker ownership of the means of production. But not only did this intellectual giant Marx deliver a pertinent political and social message about the dangers of markets and industrialization, he also developed and presented a totally new way of viewing history, a totally new way of viewing dialectics, and the ultimate development of humanity as a social creature. This development of dialectic materialism was 100% original, a break with all other thinkers before him, 100% scientific in its application, and provided a new way about thinking of human relations in a materialistic fashion. Marx essentially completed the Enlightenment. He essentially extended scientific processes to the subject of humanity. But, like all myths, almost none of this is true. Criticisms of corporatism, criticisms of the Industrial Revolution, criticisms of pure free market economics of the Adam Smith variety were incredibly popular during Marx's time. They in fact existed all the way through the 18th century, since the development of industrialization and the joint stock corporation. Marx wasn't so much the first person to point out the flaws of market-driven industrial corporatism. He was more or less just someone who jumped on the bandwagon. Moreover, Marx's intellectual brainchild, dialectic materialism, is anything but original. Marx's theory is more or less a carbon copy of George Friedrich Hegel's idea of dialectic history, with the injection of a thoroughgoing materialism and the substitution of class politics as the driving force between all dialectic struggles in human history. And here, in its origins with Hegelianism, I think we see a large problem with Karl Marx, and more so what Karl Marx's ideology has become in the modern era. Now, to my own mind, I find the thinker Hegel to be a singularly troubling philosopher. Equal measures impenetrable and abstract, one can read Hegel and never feel like they truly understand what he was getting at. I have read some Hegel and have talked to experts on the philosopher, but after most of this examination, I've come away with little more than what you could get from a first-year philosophy textbook's summary on what Hegel thought. Hegel's efforts really were to understand the movement of human thought and human ideology as it exists in collectives, as it persists through time and history. In some ways, this is a differentiation between earlier Enlightenment philosophers like Descartes, who imagined ideology almost as a singularly individual phenomenon. Most famously, Hegel imagined the growth and decline of ideas being driven by a dialectic, a competition between two forces at any given time. There would be a thesis and then an antithesis, and through conflict they would eventually come to some type of synthesis, a combination that would move the human race forward. Through this process, one could imagine a type of spirit of the age developing, a zeitgeist as Hegel put it. A very interesting and evocative theory, and one that I do not want to dress down here. I personally think that it is impossible to divorce Hegel from his role in German idealism, and I think it is unclear exactly how much this concept of dialectic history was actually meant to be applied in the real world. How much of Hegel's speculations were pure philosophical musings and models, the music of the spheres, and how much of his ideas were meant to be brought into political realities, read in flag and bayonet. I notice that most experts on Hegel tend to take his own political recommendations with a grain of salt, considering that Hegel himself considered the culmination of the zeitgeist, the true synthesis of ideas, to be his own native Prussia, a military state, a despotism that very few thinkers considered to be ideal, even for the time. But nevertheless, I think we see that whatever the merit of Hegel's ideas are on their face, problems start entering in when we get to Karl Marx and his modifications. Marx took Hegel's concept of dialectic history and unmoored it from its roots in German idealism, constructing it purely as a materialistic philosophy, thus creating dialectic materialism. Moreover, he substituted into the dialectic his own focus on class warfare, which it seems to me he wanted to talk about anyway, thus creating in the process not a means to understand societal transformation in any given stage of history, but an all-consuming model of how human organization persisted at all times in human existence. a prescriptive model about how things would take place, how they had taken place in the past, an explanation about how humans related psychologically and ethically to one another at a very, very low scale, in addition to being a theory about how human relationships persisted at the large scale. Moreover, this dialectic materialism created an eschatological vision, a narrative for all human existence, which really could contain no rival theories. All human stories were moving in the wake of Marx's notion of dialectic history, and there were really no other relevant stories to tell. There really couldn't be. To be slightly more specific about Marx's vision, Marxism proposes that all conflicts in human history are fundamentally economic and persist between an owner class and a working class, which can be easily identified at any period of history. This struggle between worker and ruling classes has driven all major transformation in our civilization and in the human race generally, creating a pattern of history that can be easily modeled and easily predicted in a scientific, materialist fashion. Here, Marx explicitly introduces 3 stages of history that one can broadly suss out using his dialectic materialist theory. The first stage, feudalism, under which most post-Iron Age but primitive societies function under, is one in which military rulers control the means of production, and serfs or peasants, or in some cases even slaves, work as properties of the feudal class. Class distinctions are solid, unmoving, and materials are exchanged directly, starting from the peasants that produce them, grow them, or mine them, and going directly to the feudal lords, which extract them as taxes or as booty. Once more, the peasant, serf, or slave has no choice in the matter. They are merely a function of the system, and in many ways they could be considered the feudal lord's property, although there is some key distinction between serfdom and slavery. Moving forward, Marx's dialectic materialist history showed a transformation from feudalism to something that Marx called capitalism, in which the feudal class was replaced by a class of bankers and industrialists. Here, trade was the dominant mechanism, and the power over the means of production was procured through investment finance. The people who owned the means of production were characterized not by means of birth, but just by the virtue that they owned the means of production, that they had come into possession of them. And this created an implicit class division between them and the working class, which was, under Marx's reading, getting worse and worse and worse as time went on. And here, Marx envisioned a third transformation, a move towards socialism, vaguely described, a system of equality where the workers would own the means of production, which of course would be brought about dialectically when capitalist power had gotten so self-contradictory and so large that revolution was the only option left to the people who were forced to sell their labor in the open market. And this 3-stage view of history is in essence the main contribution of Marxism and communism. It is the main result of applying dialectic materialism to our understanding of human relations in history, and immediately we see problems. In many ways, Marx has doubled down on enlightenment over confidence. He describes human transformations, events in the future, as if he's witnessing them in the past, as if he's looking at the transformation from capitalism to socialism as if it's already happened. This is a fatal conceit that I think is highly troubling for Marx's pretension to be scientific in his appraisal of human history, a title that Marxists are very wont to obtain, even though they deny it when called out on this bullshit. But more than just the standard enlightenment over confidence, I think this narrative of history provides a more fundamental problem, a problem that naturally leads it into making mistakes about human nature, and a problem that causes the followers of Marxism to continue making the same mistakes 150 years after their originator is dead and buried in the ground. And unfortunately, this problem is directly linked to what makes Marxism so seductive, what makes Marxism so appealing to younger idealistic thinkers. And this is the fundamental narrative and eschatological nature to this concept of history. There is a seductive, progressive pattern to this. Oftentimes we think of Marxists being fundamentally anti-capitalist, but the real villain in this picture of history, the real baddie that we are trying to overcome and get away from, is feudalism, the first stage. Now, by the time that Marx had become popular, the last vestiges of feudalism, and certainly feudal economies, were being washed away, were being eroded at ever faster and faster speed. In criticizing feudalism as being backwards and ineffective, Marx was more or less flogging a dead horse, and he knew that. But I think in a critical move of ingenious marketing, Marx realized that he could tell the same narrative about the corporatist system that was coming to replace the feudal system. That it too would be washed away by the revolutions that were rocking the monarchies of Europe, as he wrote. Moreover, since the French Revolution had demonstrated that no contrived societies developed in the wake of revolutions would necessarily be good and just, Marx was free to substitute in the result of this second-order revolution, the revolution against the corporate structure, as the means to an end that really would be truly good, just, and even utopian. Socialism, in Marx's view, the ultimate end of human organization, was nothing less than scientifically organized humanity, the dream of the French Revolution, but this time for real. It was, for lack of a better word, utopian. And I know modern Marxists shy away from the word because, well, they know they have to. But as vaguely as Marx describes communism or socialism, it is obvious that he has a very utopian vision of what this will entail when it comes to fruition. He talks about a world completely devoid of any scarcity, want, or competition, where human beings are free to hunt and fish in the morning, farm in the evening, and philosophize and do literary criticism at night. This, I think, is more akin to a vision of a land of milk and honey than it is any realistic description of an actual form of human organization. But we see here that this three-part stage of humanity is very, very seductive, very, very simple. There is the bad old system of despotism and monarchy, followed by the middle system of capitalism, followed by the ultimate utopian system of socialism. We are inevitably on the path to the perfect society, and the Enlightenment ideas will bring us there, as long as we follow Karl Marx, that is. But before I go too far afield on this, I want to point out one interesting thing when it comes to analyzing the original subject of this video, the word capitalism. Because in all of this Marxist grand narrative, capitalism plays a very, very strange role. As we see from the simplified diagram, it is in fact a middle stage between a system that was entirely bad and some future system that will be entirely good. And in this way, capitalism is more or less just seen as a middle period, a transitory stage, not really any specific mode of operation in humanity, just the waiting room before we enter the utopian vision of socialism that Marx promises. Although Marx does make some fair observations about markets and places, we will see that the role of capitalism is really much more elusive and vague. As Marx's theory develops, it is little more than an obstacle to socialism, something that stands in the way, something that holds humanity back. And as Marx's theory developed, both through the later careers of Marx and Engels, and also later Marxist philosophers that came after them, the role of capitalism grew larger and larger as a catch-all explanation for any and all human misery. Capitalism was the reason for our alienation from the means of production. Capitalism was the reason for our psychological problems, our problems with spirituality and the family, our problems relating to our fellow man. If capitalism could be removed or mitigated or destroyed, all of these problems, like the capitalist ownership class itself, would simply fade away, would simply no longer be issues. I would propose here that as much as Marxists talk about capitalism, the word to them really doesn't have very many qualities. It is only a placeholder, a middle stage between two things. A sort of Nietzschean tightrope, if you will. Now, of course, I understand that if a Marxist were here, he would probably say something like, well, the transition from feudalism to capitalism is something that we can definitively observe. And in fact, Distributist, didn't you point out some similar revolution at the beginning of this video? That's what we mean by capitalism. And sure enough, we can see a certain type of economic revolution. As I've mentioned, there was both the market revolution and the industrial and corporate revolutions. These did mark a type of transition away from feudal organization, albeit gradually. But I think that this transformation, this institution, is quite definitively not what Marxists mean by capitalism. They mean something much more vague. And I think we can see this not by comparing capitalism to what came before, but by comparing what differentiates what Marxists believe to be capitalism from what Marxists believe to be socialism. When Marxists say that they want to have socialism replace capitalism, do they actually mean they want to have one form of real human economic organization replace our current one? Or do they simply mean they want a utopian eschaton, and they want to tear down whatever and whoever they think vaguely stands in the way of this utopian eschaton? If they're interested in procuring a real economic system, it shouldn't be hard to describe that system. But I've noticed something strange when I've asked Marxists about what socialism entails and how it's different from our present system. There don't appear to be any really good answers. The first and most common answer I get when I ask Marxists what defines socialism is that it's fundamentally post-scarcity. There is no scarcity, there is no want. We have the ability to produce as many resources as we need to have society thrive. This goes a long way to explaining how Marx so flippantly describes the removal of division of labor, one of the most fundamental organizing principles of human society since the Iron Age. Marx is assuming that there will be no scarcity, that production will be in so excess of human demands, that really nothing can happen organizationally to perturb that, to create genuine want. But in this answer, I just see nothing more than an intellectually dishonest cop-out. Again, I'm not asking for a description of a utopia. I'm not asking for some vision of the end times, some get out of human problems free card. I'm asking about a real economic system that you presumably want to install in place of the real present economic system. Saying that your economic system operates under conditions of post-scarcity is like saying that you have a flying machine that only operates under conditions of zero gravity. What does it even mean? Economic systems are designed to mitigate scarcity. The only reason why we even have an economic system is because of scarcity. The decisions it makes is over who gets what and how the incentives are aligned. In a situation of total non-scarcity, we're not talking about economics anymore. We're just talking about wish fulfillment. Letting a thinker talk about designing an economic system under conditions of post-scarcity is like having an engineer design energy-efficient power plants under conditions of infinite energy. The circumstances make the entire problem ridiculous to begin with. But once we remove ourselves from just the quality of post-scarcity that's supposed to necessarily inhabit the Marxist socialist utopia, other descriptors are much harder to come by. Would, for instance, socialism be totally devoid of inequality? Most Marxists historically would say yes. Under socialism and communism, all people are equal. That's implicitly what socialism and communism communicates, right? Well, perhaps. But there's a fundamental problem with equality when we talk about it realistically, and that is that it is simply unachievable. Leaving aside the fact that we say all men are created equal as a legal fiction, they most certainly are not created equal in reality. Humans are individually different, and possibly groups of humans may be different on average. Under these real circumstances of human existence, what does it even mean to have no inequality? In fact, Marx himself even partially realized that this pursuit of equality was meaningless. He toyed with the example of two workers who worked a different amount of time at any given task. If we compensated the two workers equally, one worker would have worked harder for the same amount of compensation. However, if we compensated them differently, one would ultimately have more resources to spend. There could not be equality in any way, shape, or form, not unless there is uniformity, both of characteristics and also of action. I notice a lot more intelligent Marxists tend to back away from talking about how inequality will be abolished under socialism. But if we agree that inequality won't be entirely abolished under socialism, all we are talking about is the transformation of one inequality under capitalism to another one under socialism, under communism. And I care very deeply about how socialism describes and justifies its own inequalities. But here, of course, the conversation comes to an end, because as much as an intelligent Marxist might admit that there will naturally be inequalities, it is verboten under Marxist theory to ever talk about them or discuss their organization in detail. That would destroy the narrative. So here we are left with a distinction that isn't a distinction, that is merely a vague emotion. And the problem persists if we vary ourselves a little bit and discuss hierarchy. Is there not going to be hierarchy under a socialist or communist system? Once more, opposing hierarchy is a staple of communist and Marxist ideas, of communist and Marxist talking points. And any ordinary communist activist you grill on the streets will certainly say that there will be no hierarchies under communism or socialism. But this again is ridiculous. Humans are naturally hierarchical. We have a need to divide labor, to gather around leaders, to have certain discrete decisions be made at certain discrete points, and that will naturally result in a hierarchy. Of course, perhaps some type of pure democracy could exist at the most localized form of human existence, the type of organization you might see in a hunter and gatherer society. But this quickly falls apart when we get to something that looks like a modern nation, let alone the world or humanity as a whole. You're not going to have 6 billion people voting in a direct democracy over every single decision everywhere. Leaders will have to be selected, those leaders will have authority, and that will implicitly create hierarchy. And how will socialism organize this hierarchy? How will socialist hierarchy be better than capitalist hierarchy? Well, crickets. Because we can't admit that socialism will have hierarchy, we can't talk about it. It's emotionally dissonant, and therefore the distinction is simply not addressed. We are assured somehow that the hierarchy under socialism will be better than the hierarchy under our present economic order, but this is merely an emotional assurance. There is no actual argument or demonstration behind it. And we disappear once more into vagaries. And this fundamental vagueness about the distinction between capitalism and socialism on the part of Marxists persists even when we talk about one thing that Marx distinctly criticized about capitalism: markets. Will socialism have markets? Will socialism use market forces to come to any sort of decisions about allocations of goods? Well, classically, Marxists would obviously say no. It has to be centrally organized, because central organization is the only way that we can have democratic input. But once more, I see modern Marxists tend to walk away from this classical notion of socialism. This is largely because there have been quite definitive economic theories developed by people like Hayek and von Mises that have pointed out the necessity of markets and market decisions to operate in order to come to some equilibrium point between incentive and desire. There may not be any way to compute the price or value of anything without a market or some system that is so similar to a market that we might as well call it a market. And this theoretical problem that von Mises and Hayek pointed out matches up very closely to real problems seen by command economies in the 20th century. There is a problem of demand and distribution, and it won't go away. This has led some socialists and some communists to talk about market socialism, or communism with some implicit controlled markets. But this only creates more confusion. What are we even talking about? What is this socialist utopia except for a promise of non-scarcity and platitudes about removing things that we can't possibly remove from human experience? We can't guarantee we're getting rid of markets. We can't guarantee we're getting rid of hierarchy. We can't guarantee we're getting rid of inequality. But we're not going to talk about how we're managing those problems. We're just going to assert that it's going to be perfect. And oh, by the way, there's not going to be any scarcity. And this is all science. But in reality, I think it's obvious that nothing rigorous has been done. Only an emotion has been expressed. And as distinct as the post-industrial corporate system is from the feudal system it replaced, we see that in its distinction from any future socialist system, it is little more than an amorphous blob, designed to fill in anything that the socialist or communist doesn't like and wants to tear down. We're not so much for any given economic system. We're not even necessarily against inequality, hierarchy, or markets. We're just against capitalist inequality, capitalist hierarchy, and capitalist markets. But to be absolutely charitable, even with this construction, we cannot completely dismiss the communist critique of our present order, of quote-unquote capitalism. After all, there could be real political objections of a much more confined order. Perhaps communists, perhaps Marxists, just want to get rid of a certain kind, a certain variety of ruler, or a certain type of market, a certain variety of hierarchical organization. Perhaps we could say that communists just want to get rid of the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, a specific class. They just want to get rid of private property, a certain kind of property, and they just want to get rid of centralization, the mode of organizing humans at a very, very high level, where direct democracy and direct accountability become impossible. And these are very, very legitimate concerns. Lord knows I think our society is materialistic. I don't particularly like our current capitalist global ruling class. And I'm a huge advocate for localization of all types. So maybe there is a legitimate critique here. A much smaller critique than the sweeping descriptions Marx originally made, but a legitimate one. But here, once more, I think we see Marxists choke to death on their own theory, choke to death on their own notion of what capitalism is, that they inherited from Marxist dialectic view of history. If modern Marxists and communists really want to make a more specific criticism of private property and capitalists or the bourgeoisie, if they really want to abolish centralization or the overabundance of private property, then they should have very, very easy answers for what these things are, right?
I'm not a communist. Well, why not? I like stuff. I like this, and I like this, and I like this. That's why I can't be a communist. Justine, you do realize that Marxism distinguishes between private property and personal property, right? You're allowed to own possessions, you just can't exploit people by owning the means of production.
Interestingly enough, if you ask a Marxist or a communist, what is private property? What is this type of possession you want to ban or destroy? You get a very interesting conversation. Of course, there's the programmed response, oh, well, we're against private property, not personal property. But if you press them on this further, you'll see that the distinction is more or less meaningless. There are very many forms of personal property that Marxists would very much want to get rid of, and many forms of private property that they would likely want to preserve. Now, to be clear, there is something of a distinction between personal and private property that I think any reasonable person can make. We can see that there are things that we take or own that are really only for our own consumption, or are really only for our own family's consumption, and provide no greater wealth or advantage. The classic example of this would be something like a bagel, or to borrow an example from the YouTuber Morgoth, a fried chicken. I have the bagel or the fried chicken, and I eat the bagel or fried chicken, and that's the end of the story. I merely consume it for my own pleasure or sustenance. There's nothing greater. And this is very distinct from an object that is capital, in the way that we use the word in industry and in business. Capital is an object, a possession of wealth, that creates more wealth. Think, for instance, like a factory, or a dump truck, or a cement mixer. Possessing that object allows you to create other objects, which allows you to get more wealth over time, sometimes purely passively, as in the example of a stock. The object grows in value, and no additional work needs to be taken to create that value. If you possess the capital, if you own it, then you are going to increase in wealth. And I want to be clear, this is a meaningful distinction. When people say they want to get rid of private property but not personal property, that does mean something. We can imagine a future where you're allowed to keep your food and the clothes on your back, and one or two sentimental items like your toothbrush or maybe a rosary, given that it's not made of gold or some other valuable metal that might appreciate. And then all the other large objects like vehicles and businesses, machines and houses would be centrally organized, distributed from some hopefully democratic authority. That is a meaningful desire, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that no one really means it when they say it. Like I said, there's a fair amount of personal property that socialists want to get rid of, and a fair amount of private property that they want to maintain. And to demonstrate this, I can think of no better example than the YouTuber Natalie Wynn, who produces videos under the name ContraPoints online. About a year ago, ContraPoints produced a video series on the subject of capitalism, Natalie themselves being a very ostentatious user of consumer items, both in their online persona and by their own admission offline. The contradiction between liking personal property and condemning private property was prominently on display. And once more, the distinction was brought up between the private and the personal, between that which we consume and that which we use to gain more wealth. This was a very useful distinction, and it certainly made the video series work. But in ContraPoint's case in particular, I don't believe it. ContraPoints is in possession of a very, very, very lucrative piece of private property called their YouTube channel. A piece of property that is probably earning more money for them due to its passive characteristics, e.g. its subscriber count, rather than the actual work that Natalie puts into any given video. Just as a fellow YouTuber, I can tell you how this works. Every YouTuber who does this has a video that they poured their heart and soul into early in their career, which got almost no views due to their then rather low subscriber count, but then has a totally throwaway video that they put almost no effort into later in their career, reach almost viral proportions due to the fact that their channel had just accumulated, passively, a much, much larger audience. A YouTube channel is capital. It does generate wealth passively, and it is therefore private and not personal property. For instance, does anyone think that Natalie Wynn would allow me to post one of my videos to their much, much larger audience, and in exchange they could post a video to mine? Would they have to agree to that? Well, under the concept of private property being wrong and undemocratic, it seems like they would have to. But that act of forcing someone to put their livelihood, to put their life's work towards some end that they fundamentally disagree with, seems to be a violation of their rights of individual autonomy and self-expression. More of a violation than if I had just stolen Natalie Wynn's toothbrush. There is private property that seems to be sacred, that seems to be inviolable. Moreover, personal property isn't nearly as fundamental to our beings as we might ordinarily suspect. To return once more to the ContraPoints example, when criticizing capitalism, ContraPoints seizes on one aspect of consumption that they consider to be egregiously wrong. And that is the creation and consumption of a golden pizza in some chic, bourgeoisie New York restaurant that caters to the super wealthy. ContraPoints seems visibly disgusted by the existence of the golden pizza. It is a crime against food, but also against the people that could have used that wealth for things that are more important, more fundamental to their very being. And as a conservative, reactionary Catholic distributist, I wholeheartedly agree. The golden pizza seems decadent. It seems degenerate. It seems like a violation of something fundamentally human. In ContraPoint's words, it's also just really bad pizza. But herein comes another problem. Because as decadent and as blasphemous as the golden pizza is that ContraPoints points out as a product of capitalism, it is at the end of the day definitively personal property. No one else is going to eat that golden pizza, and it's certainly not going to generate wealth like a piece of capital. The whole preference for personal property above private property seems to walk away from a core piece of wisdom that Christian civilization, and here I mean implicitly Protestant Christian civilization, developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. The notion that in many ways, once one excludes purely critical, sentimental, and religious objects, like food, Bibles, worship material, and shelter, the production and cultivation of private property is actually superior to the production and cultivation of personal property. Private property can be passed down. Private property can be used to make a better world for your descendants. It is fundamentally in a mode of pleasure deferment. We are consuming less wealth in the present so that we can get more wealth in the future. This, in many ways, was the basis for Protestant capitalism to begin with. You needed a way to invest your wealth, as opposed to simply blowing it on decadent dinners and gold robes for yourself, like many of the Southern Europeans did. Now, of course, while I think this Protestant instinct was taken to a ridiculous and egregious end in the 19th century, it did go too far. It nonetheless does contain wisdom. Private property is a good thing, and that private property that we build ourselves usually defines us more than the things that we consume only to our own ends. And I think we can see this quite definitively in the example of ContraPoints, their YouTube channel versus their golden pizza. Which do they value more? I think the answer is obvious. And any communist or socialist asked the same question will give you the same answer. There is a distinction between private and personal property, but it is not a distinction that the communist or socialist really believes in or respects. They do not actually want to draw a line between the two of them. There is no real principle here. A similar problem comes up when we talk about the abolition of the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class. Now, of course, we could conceptualize communism, we could conceptualize Marxism as being a specific problem with a specific kind of people ruling us. And I think that this is a meaningful objection, but once more, not one that they really mean. What does it even mean to be bourgeoisie or in the capitalist class to begin with? The question is harder than one might initially think. Now, in the 19th century, I think this was a much easier question to answer. The capitalists, the owner class, were the people with the giant top hats and the big money bags. This is the image of the Monopoly man in Scrooge McDuck. And it's arguable that communism's vision of who are the bourgeoisie or the ruling class has never really evolved out of this 19th century mold. But once we leave the 19th century and examine the economy that developed in the early 20th, and really any time after the initial Industrial Revolution, we see that this model of the bourgeoisie is no longer really satisfactory. Are capitalists really just the people who own the businesses? Well, in some sense, there are the chairmen of the board, there are the super rich who own all the large portfolios and the stock options, that have the big stakes in the investment banks. But then there are also the tinier capitalists, the small business owners, the medium-sized business owners, the people that make lots of money off of their YouTube channel. Technically, they're all owners too, right? Moreover, the real urban big shots, the people that we oftentimes look on with contempt, the classes that we imagine as our betters, the trial lawyers, the CEOs, the big shot bankers, those are all employees. Yes, they get a really large wage, but they still are technically not owners. Is the medium-sized business owner I know, who can barely make ends meet and barely cut himself in on a $40,000 yearly margin, part of the bourgeoisie owner class? And the big shot trial lawyer who has just made $2 million this year and is buying outright his third house, part of the working class? That doesn't seem to make any sense. For this reason, and for many others, Marxists have been constantly want to move the meaning of what it means to be bourgeoisie or part of the owner class that we must abolish. Sometimes it means owners, but sometimes it also means well-to-do people, people who are making good on the system. As Marxism evolved and capitalism became a boogeyman that we attributed more spiritual and psychological problems to, it became necessary to expand the definition of the bourgeoisie, down and down, until the word more or less meant what it originally meant in the French Revolution, e.g., anyone who was well-to-do or middle class, anyone who directly didn't get their hands dirty with hard, industrial, non-intellectual labor. Under this definition, almost everyone is bourgeoisie. Almost everyone, at least in the first world, benefits from the current system. Are we trying to abolish ourselves? Is the bourgeoisie culture that we produce and consume the beating heart of capitalist alienation? I find that hard to believe, and I think most modern Marxists who tend to be from the educated bourgeoisie class also find that hard to believe. Perhaps when we talk about the bourgeoisie, we're only talking about a very, very small number of oligarchic businessmen who are simultaneously owners and CEOs. But this is an increasingly small number of people, and it doesn't seem to support the type of radical change that most Marxists envision. Taxing away obscene amounts of capital gains isn't really a radical proposition, it's more or less what everyone is talking about, a few minor libertarian communities notwithstanding. So ultimately, the modern rage against the bourgeoisie and the capitalist class seems confused, directionless, as if the chief objection to the bourgeoisie and owner classes aren't their existence in the abstract, but simply their aloofness and their role in a centralized system that puts them above many other people that they'll never meet. Which begs the last question. Is centralization necessary? And are Marxists and communists even against it? And it's under this question that I feel like the whole Marxist worldview, even in its practical dimension, comes tumbling down. On the surface of things, prima facie, the answer to is centralization something that Marxism is against is no. The Marxist vision, at least in the short term, is to centralize the organization of these businesses, to put them all under a control, an international control, that is guided, we are told, and we are asked to believe, by democratic will. But does this really solve the problem of the aloof elite that control our destinies? Does this address the fundamental objection we have to people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg when they deign to rule our lives from Silicon Valley and wherever they hold their money? Well, not really. Any centralized democratic control is not going to be particularly meaningful or accountable, and replacing Amazon with the Ministry of Distribution and Facebook with the Department of Friends is not going to solve any of the problems we have with these systems or their organization. We will still be ruled by the decrees of hierarchs who are very far above us and who have fundamentally no accountability to our desires. The only difference is that there will be less separation between these new rulers and the actual military forces that keep order. And here I think we see a very fundamental way that the Marxist worldview blinds us to the real problem we're dealing with in modernity. What is the problem with Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos? It sounds like a simple enough objection. He does own the means of production, or to be more accurate, the means of distribution. But what is the fundamental problem with the forces he represents in the world? What is the issue with the post-industrial corporatism that he represents? Of course, to a Marxist or a quote-unquote anti-capitalist, there are a lot of cheap and cute answers to this question. Jeff Bezos is rich. He has more, and therefore you have less. His wealth of personal property and consumption means that you will fundamentally be poor in terms of personal wealth and consumption. Now, leaving aside that this often repeated but uninformed Marxist objection postulates zero-sum wealth, something that more intelligent Marxists don't even believe themselves, otherwise they could not propose that there would be a post-scarcity Marxism after an organizational change. I believe that Marxist theory misses the chief problem with Jeff Bezos and the centralized order that he represents. Is the problem with Jeff Bezos that his existence as a capitalist overlord is causing you to become poorer in the personal property sense, in the consumption sense? Well, In any realistic evaluation, not really. We are consuming as modern individuals more than we ever have before. To borrow the words of the YouTuber Morgoth, we are drowning in a sea of fried chickens and plastic crap. And under the bold leadership of Jeff Bezos and Amazon and the global supply chains that he represents, we are drowning under an even larger sea of fried chickens and plastic junk. The issue is not personal property. The issue is not that Jeff Bezos is restricting personal consumption wealth from us. The issue with Jeff Bezos and the order he represents is his crimes against private property. The problem is him standing in the way of other individuals becoming capitalists, of becoming masters of their own destiny. We are consuming more than ever under the reign of Amazon, but we are further and further away from actually working to produce that wealth, of being owners and investors in the systems that produce that wealth. And that's the real problem. We need a concept of legitimate private property even to really describe the problems with corporatism in the modern age. And Marxist language and theory blinds us to that central issue. We know that Marxists want to get rid of private property, but they really don't. We know that Marxists want to get rid of the bourgeoisie and the ownership class, except they don't know who they really are. We know that Marxists want to address the issue of power centralization, but they really don't. And we are to understand that Marxists and communists want to address the issue that common people do not own their own capital, but they lack the language in which to describe the legitimate individual ownership of capital to begin with. We have a vague understanding that capitalism is standing in the way of some future utopia, but we don't know whether this utopia is going to be completely equal. We have a relative certainty that there is going to be some kind of hierarchy, perhaps even markets, and all we are left with, the key assurance we have that the new system of socialism will be better than the one we left, is the prediction, or should I say hope, that in this new system, somehow, magically, scarcity, again, the condition which all economics chooses to address, will suddenly disapparate for no real reason. Or I should say, no real reason that stems directly from the organization of socialism itself. And so we are left with nothing. We are left with the word capitalism being a kind of spook, a placeholder that generates nothing that we can really sink our teeth into, realistically or even theoretically. Someone can say, I want to smash capitalism, or capitalism is responsible for this or that bad thing in the world, but I have no idea what they mean, or no idea how that observation is supposed to help us come to any kind of rectification of that problem. It's purely an emotional sentiment. But if this is the case, why do people continue to follow this ideology? Why has it grown in prominence? And here I think the issues begin and end with the problems of theory. Under the most honest appraisal of Marxist theory, what does capitalism mean? Well, it's simply an element of a theory. It's simply a product of a Hegelian notion of historical evolution. It's not a real thing. It doesn't describe any reality that humans deal with. It is simply a placeholder inside a model that exists only on paper, a model that shows humanity going from the bad feudalism to a middle placeholder stage called capitalism, eventually to the good optimal socialism. The word capitalism doesn't have a real-world analogy, because it's not a real-world object. It is like an imaginary number, or the concept of infinity, something that exists as a metaphysical abstraction, but not as any real thing that you can experience, at least not in a formal, non-emotional sense. And I think if we were still dealing with German idealism under the concept of Hegel, we wouldn't really have a lot of problems with this. I am, by my reputation and by my own pronouncements, an anti-theoretician when it comes to political dialogue and cultural conversation. I like practicality, I like empiricism. And while I deeply value the notion of metaphysics and pure theory when it comes to mathematics and religion, I think it really has not a large role to play when it comes to describing human social organization. However, in spite of this, I don't want to completely sell theory short. It does have its uses. Theory and abstraction help human minds think about things in new and different ways. Aristotelian physics, as abstract and wrong as it ultimately was, created a theoretical mold that eventually led to Newtonian physics, and from there eventually led to relativity. The Platonic view of the universe, while ultimately over-abstract and metaphysical, did lead to critical concepts of rights and social organizations that I think are highly valuable and indeed defining to how the West organizes itself on the political front. These are all good things, and theory had a huge role to play. But theory also has some very, very distinct limitations. And that is that it is almost always only a starting off point, a thought experiment, a way to get you to see things you didn't know were there, but not vision itself. Even in the realm of physics, to my mind, one of the only sciences that has really seen the pristine predictability of theoretical models. Situations where theory led and empiricism followed are distinctly minority cases. More often than not, observations precede our description of them in theoretical textbooks. Moreover, physics is replete with examples of theoretical constructions designed only to get people to think in certain original ways, to help them to think about how certain subatomic or invisible concepts work in the abstract. Perhaps the classic example of this would be Schrödinger's cat, an analogy that all college freshmen seem to memorize and repeat as if it's profound. In the analogy, a cat that is inside a box with a cyanide capsule is left standing while a subatomic detector decides randomly whether to shatter the cyanide capsule and kill the cat or whether to leave it preserved, and therefore save the cat's life. Schrödinger postulated that the cat was both alive and dead at the same time. Now, of course, Schrödinger meant this to be an analogy, a thought experiment, a way of getting ourselves in the mode of thinking about how subatomic particles work. In real life, if you put a cat in a box with a cyanide capsule and maybe break it, the cat is either going to be alive or dead afterwards. There's not going to be an in-between state. And using this theoretical model, Schrödinger certainly did not open a pet shop where he sold people half alive and half dead cats. That would just be silly. But I do think that this very silliness is on display in dialectic materialism. The barrier between theory and reality is broken down by Marx, and people treat these hypothetical constructions, these stages of history, as if they're actually observing them in a test tube. In reality, Marx hasn't observed humanity transitioning from feudalism to capitalism, and has no reason to believe there's a transition from capitalism to socialism, whatever that means, and as vaguely as that's ever defined. Yet the imagination of leftists, the imagination of those who want to speak out against the corporate system that we currently have, is captured by this ridiculous theory, by this ridiculously vague theory. We need to tear down this spook, this boogeyman called capitalism, and the only thing that can flow forth is pure, unadulterated goodness, because that is what eventually will happen due to the Hegelian theoretical model. Once again, there's nothing wrong talking this way if you're some poet or some theoretician locked away in the ivory tower of the academy, but it's a little bit dangerous when this magical thinking actually invades physical politics, which Marxism and communism invariably does. I think you see just this kind of magical thinking on display in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal, which could only be charitably described as a thought experiment. As legislation, it's manifestly ridiculous, talking about retrofitting every building in the entire continent, removing cow farts and banning air travel, with really no realistic discussions of the alternatives or the systems that need to come in to replace them. Keep in mind, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez isn't a professor. She's not a poet. She isn't writing a song like Imagine. She isn't responsible for expanding our imaginations. She isn't responsible for writing obscure academic articles. She's a legislator. She's responsible for creating actual law in one of the most powerful legislative bodies in the entire planet. Contrary to popular belief, legislators aren't the place to try to spearhead crazy ideas that will never work. They're for actually proposing realistic things to do that will manifestly make the country and the world better. But then, what is the response once people point out the obvious? Once people point out that none of what Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez proposes in this bill will work the way she says it will? Well, once again, the response is to point to theory, to return to Marxist bellyaching about capitalism, a concept that isn't even coherently defined on paper. I think here of a recent video by Zero Books and Ben Burgess, who react to the manifest ridiculousness of a piece of real practical legislation with complaints about capitalism, with pointing out that the critics of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez are supporters of capitalism, which under the strict Marxist definition includes all private property and the functioning of a market. Of course, under this definition, everyone is a capitalist. Bernie Sanders is a capitalist, and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, despite her best efforts, is also a capitalist. Nevertheless, the spook is trotted out every time we have to have a serious conversation about economic realities in this world. This response from the intellectual left to retreat to meaningless theoretical pronouncements would be funny if it wasn't tragic. It expresses a sort of demented detachment that can only come from being so in love with the theoretical foundation of something, one forgets what the whole point of politics is to begin with. The point of legislation is to work, not to fill some kind of center place in your theory about how history is going to operate. This would be somewhat equivalent to an art history major praising Leonardo da Vinci's concept of the helicopter as being bold, artistic, and original, then trying to force his family onto a scale model of that helicopter and toss them off a cliff in it. Leonardo da Vinci's concept of the helicopter may have been a provocative theoretical sketch for his time, but it does not destroy the fact that the thing doesn't fly. It doesn't work, regardless of how much we like the theory. And if we're not careful, in the end, this whole mode of thinking is going to get a lot of people killed and still make no progress in addressing the actual ills of corporate post-industrial organization. And this is all because we can't get over the theoretical magical word called capitalism. The boogeyman that prohibits all good and promises everything one could possibly desire upon its abolition, and means, in the end, ultimately nothing. One might here speculate about the ruin of theory, and the ruination that the word capitalism represents. To me, the word represents everything wrong about how we've discussed economics. We've started with post-Enlightenment notions about how humanity should operate, when we should first be talking about what defines humanity, what defines our values about humanity, and then asking practically how we can go about achieving those ends. We've been hoodwinked with eschatological narratives about human progress and visions of perfectly scientifically organized societies. But none of this is real. And in the meantime, real human needs go unmet and problems go unaddressed. To me, ultimately, this is where Marxism ends and why it is, in my mind, a failure, an intellectual embarrassment in the tradition of the West. As bad as communism has been in many ways, it's not nearly as bad as the issues it's helped humanity avoid. The only reason why we're still talking about it is that communist vision is seductive, not even in a theoretical way, but in a religious one. Communism provides for the non-believer a vision and narrative about humanity that most healthy individuals get from religion. And if Marxism were more fundamentally honest with itself, it would present itself as a religious belief, as a faith, and contend for power in the modern world as such. But thanks to Enlightenment myths, we have to put up with the notion that Marxism is somehow scientific, and this amounts to something more than an ideological narrative about how humanity should operate, and not how humanity actually does. In the end, I will say this about Marxists: Their feeling that Marx provides something necessary is true. In order to have any conversation about what should happen in the future, economically, politically, or spiritually, to humanity, we have to have some kind of religious formulation about what it means to be human and about the narrative that humanity is playing out. In that sense, Marxism provides something that is necessary. It just doesn't provide it honestly. And in the wake of this dishonesty, we have to deal with a system that provides no moral self-examination, nor conversation about the fundamental values we want to pursue economically going forward. It's these moral and value-based questions we have to answer honestly before we begin a process of practical application of economics. And in the future, I think it will be an economic system that takes these moral and indeed spiritual questions seriously at the outset, that will finally address the issues of corporatism, industrialization, and indeed all modernity. It will be an honest examination of human spirituality and value that will lead mankind forward, not theoretical spooks born out of late Enlightenment pseudoscience.